This program was made possible by a grant from S.R. Foxley and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you wish to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below. So I'm sorry it's been so long since I've actually gotten in front of the camera and talked to you, but you know, Christmas and all that. For my big comeback, I thought I'd finally spend a video or two getting back into the Dumb Things People Say to Atheists series. I'll link the earlier videos below and maybe get around to making a better system of playlists, but please, for your safety, don't hold your breath. Now this dumb thing will be different from the rest I've done so far, in that it's not really an insult at all. It's more of an annoying device meant to cut off conversation once someone's backed into a corner. See, Christians have no basis whatsoever for what they believe, and deep down a lot of them kinda know it. So as you might expect, things get a little tense when you start asking too many questions. And once you work your way past the canned excuses they learned from apologists, they'll realize they have nowhere else to go. At which point, a lot of them will just burn the conversation to the ground with a quick one-liner that lets them flatly ignore literally any logical problem you bring to their attention, no matter how obvious it is, no matter how clearly and conclusively it demonstrates the inconsistency of their beliefs. And that is, who are you to question an all-knowing God? Of course, this is more something people ask atheists than something people say to atheists, but there are different ways of phrasing it, and... Wait, is there even a rule that a person can't say a question? Or... Now, to be fair, I understand the appeal of this question, and I can get why it's a regular part of Christians' vocabulary when they talk to skeptics. I often struggled with my faith when I was a Christian, a great surprise to all of you, I'm sure, and as I worked my way through various rationalizations for my belief, I often found myself having to fall back on the idea that some things are just a mystery, that I can't comprehend everything about God or the way His universe works, and that I ultimately just have to trust that He knows better than I do. Of course, for this trust to make sense, God would have had to reliably demonstrate the fact that He's trustworthy, or that He even f***ing exists as far as that goes. But if you're struggling to believe something you're emotionally invested in, this is a place your mind's going to go. I've been there myself, and I understand the internal tension that leads you to this excuse, so I can sincerely sympathize. However, while understandable, this is clearly not a rational reason to believe in or dismiss doubts about an undemonstrated being. It really only works for believers who want to quietly resolve issues in their pre-existing belief system, and it gains no traction whatsoever when talking to a person who doesn't already believe. So whenever a Christian asks you a question like, who are you to question an all-knowing God, they're just being plain silly for a couple reasons. First and most obviously, you're not questioning an all-knowing God. You're questioning a person who tells you an all-knowing God exists and claims to speak for Him. And in light of this fact, it becomes clear that who are you to question an all-knowing God is a pretty audacious and self-serving question. See, I've said this before, but if you're going to approach people with a claim about an unusual being or phenomena, it's incumbent upon you to demonstrate that there's good reason to believe in it, especially if you're expecting them to order their lives around your claim. Ideally, you should provide direct evidence. If you can't do that, you better make a good argument for why we should infer its existence through indirect evidence. Or at the very least, if you wish not to be laughed out of the room, you should make your claim logically consistent. Of course, the second two are usually just desperate fallbacks, and you're on super shaky ground by the time you've failed number one. But when Christians ask, who are you to question God, they're offering no evidence whatsoever, instead expecting you to just enter the conversation assuming the thing they made up exists and is all-knowing, then telling you can't question the idea of the thing they made up because of their assumption that it exists and is all-knowing. And if you wanted a way to flippantly show how dumb and presumptuous this is, you could just do this. When they say, there's a God, but He's all-knowing so you can't question Him, just say, okay, fine. But there's also a mega-God that's bigger and knows more than God. Because if God actually didn't know everything, how would we know it? And how would God know it for that matter? And who are you to question her? And the only reason I said her is because it's funny that would become a disproportionate part of what bothered them about the whole thing. Now obviously your explanation would be absurd, But here's the thing. It's only absurd for the same reason and to the same extent that it's absurd when Christians ask, "Who are you to question God?" The only difference is Christians are more used to the idea of God, so it doesn't feel as made up. But if you can't just tell a Christian not to ask common sense questions because of how you phrased your claim about a mega-God, they can't tell you not to ask common sense questions because of how they phrase their claim about God. Here's what it boils down to. When they utter the words, "Who are you to question God?" what they're really asking is, "Who are you to question me?" And they're generally trying to coerce some form of obedience or social conformity out of you when they do so. Because of course God's wishes always coincide with their personal interpretation of teachings cherry-picked from their chosen denomination or their chosen religion. But there's a whole other aspect to this, which is that even if God did obviously exist, it would be problematic to say we should never question him. As Matt Dillahunty put it, who am I to question God? Who is God that he should not be questioned? Now this sounds like a simple flippant one-liner, but it really is a good question that undercuts an assumption Christians don't think enough about. Now the notion that you shouldn't question God does have a seductive little bit of truth at its core. We all defer judgment to higher authorities, so we can easily see how, just as there are times children should listen to parents even when they can't understand why, there would be times we might show the same deference to a God. But this still leaves us with some fundamental questions. How would we arrive at this trust? After all, if a perfect, all-knowing being existed, we would have to not only discover it, but learn about its nature and come to grips with how we should interact with it. Think about it. How do you decide the being is all-knowing? How do you decide it is morally perfect? The only way you could even start arriving at these conclusions would be by observing its behavior and evaluating it according to your own pre-existing understanding of morality and intelligence. Of course, I'm not sure how you as a finite being with finite powers of observation could even conclude another being was perfect, because, for example, how could you tell an infinitely intelligent being from one that was 1,000 or even 10 times as smart as you? But the point is that to arrive at any such conclusion, you would have to judge it based on your personal understanding and ability to reason. In other words, you would have to start your relationship with that being by questioning it. But for the sake of argument, let's say that your examination of this being led you to conclude that it was just super shucky darn moral and intelligent. Could this ever lead you to a point that you just stopped questioning it and now trusted it forever no matter what it did? That you stopped at least passively noticing indications that it was or wasn't still trustworthy? The idea that this could happen is nonsense, and I would say that it would be extremely weird and unhealthy if it ever did happen. Just look at the analogy of parent and child, for example. Sure, I would hope most children would trust their parents and be willing to obey instructions that they didn't always understand. But in any healthy relationship, the child's trust would be built on having some concept of what constructive and nurturing behavior looks like and noticing that their parents seem to conform to it. Most children are always unconsciously noticing signs of how trustworthy their parents are, and I would hope that egregiously bad behavior would erode this trust. I mean, if a parent repeatedly beat or molested a sibling, should a child just shrug and ask, "Who am I to question my parents?" Of course not. Thus, even the analogy of parent and child demonstrates how in any relationship there should be some kind of ongoing evaluation of the other person's behavior. And a simple thought experiment demonstrates that even most mentally healthy Christians should question God's behavior at some point. For example, what if you saw God come down and start torturing your neighbors alive? What if he told you to murder your family? Or said to forcefully bring home a teenage girl and make her your wife? In all these situations, would you just accept his command, no matter what it was, as good, because who am I to question God? Now I know what a lot of Christians would say here. God would never command such horrors because he's God and he's good. But see, what this answer shows is that you have an internalized understanding of what's good, and you expect God to act according to it. When presented a theoretical scenario in which God behaves in a way you understand to be objectionable, you question that behavior and decide he would only act according to your expectations. As I spoke, something inside you was watching for what my fictional portrayal of God was going to do, judging it on an ongoing basis to see whether it seemed good, and being ready to reject it as God if it did not. So whether or not you consciously think about it, I think this is what you would do with God if he obviously existed and manifested himself. And the fact that you reject my thought experiment when it shows God doing things you don't like shows that if he did them, and he does them all the time in the Bible, by the way, you would certainly question him. Really, the only reason Christians can pretend they don't question him is that he doesn't exist, so they can shape their image of him to fit what they already understand is moral. So the next time a Christian asks, "Who are you to question God?" you can calmly but politely, 1. Tell them you're not questioning God, you're questioning their claims about God. 2. Explain that their question is a non-starter because it assumes God's existence to someone who doesn't believe. 3. Ask them how they decided God was perfect, which is really the core issue here. And 4. Ask what they would do if God flagrantly and unquestionably violated their idea of morality. The simple fact of the matter is, no Christian ever took any rational steps to determine that God is perfect or all-knowing. They've observed nothing about his behavior or existence, and everything they've learned about him comes from other Christians, or from a book that shows him behaving in morally questionable ways and often explicitly says he isn't all-knowing anyway. When it comes down to it, their supposed unquestioning trust in him is just a self-defense mechanism used to soothe their own internal doubts and to silence the questions of other people. Anyway, next week we'll talk about one of the most annoyingly kind dumb things people say to atheists, and that is, someone must have hurt you.